All right. Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Dissemination Essentials. It's been a month of not seeing each other, and I hope you've enjoyed your time away from the course. But we're excited to have you back and continue the second half of the program. Today we are doing Module 4, and that is on making it readable, how to organize your information. And your trainers for today are Emma Thompson and Eve Tomlinson, and you will get to meet them very shortly. Next slide, please. So we're all pros at this by now, but please mute yourself when you're not speaking. We encourage you to use the chat box as well, which we'll be monitoring and interacting on. And if you'd like to turn on or off subtitles, you can click on live transcript and either show or hide subtitles. And that should be at the bottom of your screen. If you're having trouble with that, just write in the chat box. Next slide, please. If we have time today for an in-person question or something you'd like to say out loud, you can raise your hand and we'll get to you that way, and you can unmute yourself and ask your questions through that. Next slide. So very quickly, because it seems like it's been a while ago since we did Module 3 on plain language, here were just some key takeaway messages from scanning both our interaction in the webinars and the Ask the Trainer sessions, as well as the chat that has been going on the Learning Experiences platform. So despite plain in the subject, writing in plain language is a very difficult task. The meaning of words is nuanced. They mean different things to different peoples, even if you speak the same language. Of course, this becomes more complex when we are working in Cochrane in different languages as well. It's still possible to use understandable language and write plainly while tailoring and writing to the audience you're trying to reach. And following on that, of course, thinking about and ideally including the audience that you are writing for or disseminating to in the development of your dissemination products, or just to sense check what you are writing goes a long way in ensuring that you are improving your skills in plain language writing. And there are some standards and some resources for this as well that our trainers shared in the last module. But let's move forward to how to actually structure and organize the information that you are writing. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Emma and Eve.
Hi everyone, so my name's Emma Thompson and I'll be handing over to my co-presenter Eve Tomlinson later, so you will get to meet her soon as well. But just wanted to first welcome you to this webinar entitled Making It Readable, How to Organise Your Information. Now, to give a quick overview of what we'll cover today, we're really going to explore how the way that you organise information can influence how readable it is. So we're going to start by discussing some tips for structuring content and share a particular strategy called layering, which helps people to find key messages first and then access more detail. We'll then go over how to make your content easy to scan and read, and ultimately increase the chance that your audiences will understand it. We'll talk about this in the content of some different dissemination types and share examples and go through some of the positives, the negatives, where we might improve their organisation. Then we'll have some breakout rooms where you can have a go at this yourself, and finish up with some take-home messages and homework. So now, why are we talking about this issue? Well, I think the basic principle underlying the session today is that the way you organise information influences how people are able to understand it and take the information they need from it. And I think this dovetails on very nicely from the last session on plain language. And I think you might be able to say that the way that you organise the content can be as important as the content itself, if it influences how people can understand and take the information on board. So I'll give you some quite obvious examples of where this plays out in everyday life. So on the left, this is a menu I found for a restaurant. I think you don't need to zoom in, but I think you can see that it's an overwhelming block of text, a very confusing design to me, lots of different colours, some pictures. I'm not really sure what the kind of structure is and what I'm meant to be looking at first. What's most important, and it would definitely be a scenario that if I was at this restaurant I would end up ordering something I didn't want in a panic. And then another example, I'm glad that I'm not responsible for doing this job of designing traffic systems, but this is an example of where you can have different messages in the form of signs at the same time, trying to get your intention in a short time frame, especially if you're thinking about the main people that are going to see this are drivers, so they're going at speed, they've got 5 seconds to read all of this information. How do they prioritize what they look at first, or what's most important? But the good news is, as people who are creating dissemination products that aim to support health decision making, there are different things that we can do to support our readers, and that's what we'll cover about today. So we're going to cover 2 of the dissemination checklist items, the first being item 5, which I'll cover, and then I'll hand over to Eve for item 6. So just as a quick reminder, item 5 is about structuring your content so that people can find key messages and then access more detail if they want to. And why should we think about structuring content in this way? In basic terms, people's information needs vary, and that can depend on the person to person in terms of who they are or their role. And it can also depend on the context. So how much time they have, their knowledge, their prior interest level, language skills, and so on. In the Cochrane context, you may find that some people prefer clear, short summaries of key review findings, whereas others want more access to the in-depth information on why the trials were included in a review. So then we have a question as to, well, how we can meet those different needs in a way that makes the best use of the time and resources that we have available. And that's where I'm going to share with you the strategy of layering. And layering as a strategy is useful for everyone because it takes into account the fact that different people want different information. So really it involves stratifying your content or organizing it into layers so that people can find the key messages up front and then get more access to more detail on demand if they want to. I like to see it as kind of the opposite of writing a mystery novel, where you're trying to get people to stay with you in a story by giving them pieces of information and then giving them what happens at the end. We're doing the complete opposite of that. We're telling people up front what they need to know. And then if they want to get the juicy details, they can read on. So don't worry about giving people spoilers. That's exactly what we're trying to do. And just to also highlight the fact that most audiences are likely to want those key messages first, the key results, because that might help determine whether it's a review that they're interested in and what they want to read. So this diagram here can help visualize what we mean by the different layers. So I'm going to walk you through some of these together. So we'll start with the short layer or the top layer. And this one is really the most important because it may be the only thing that people read. And it's usually the first thing that people will read. So with that in mind, we have to think about what we want our audiences to know if that's the only thing they'll see about this particular review or the thing that you're trying to promote. It needs to be short and it needs to just have your key messages. So in a Cochrane review context, that should be a brief description of the results for all the most important outcomes and an indication of the certainty of evidence. Most audiences aren't likely to want the details on the methods in the top layer. So as an example, it could be a bullet point list of key messages. So this is something that came from a Cochrane.org news item recently, just highlighting the key messages for a Cochrane review. And then later on in the article, they went into the more details. Just to flag here that it can be quite tricky to do this for a tweet, given the amount of space that you have available. Not to say it's impossible, but you can also think about using tweets in a different way, such as highlighting the fact that the review is available. Then we'll go into the middle layer. So that's the bit more detailed section. So it's for people that are wanting to go beyond that top layer. And that might be more background information, details on the methods, details on the trials that you included. So this is an example that I found on a policy brief produced by the EPOC Cochrane Review Group. So after a first page of key messages, which were in kind of bullet points, they include information about the main results and highlighted some of the trials that were included. So generally, it could be a summary of a few pages after a first page of key findings, or in a news item, it could be some more information after your list of key messages. Then finally, your comprehensive or your bottom layer, and that's generally your Cochrane review. So how are we going to do this then? Well, there's a couple of ways, and I think actually many of you will probably already be doing one way, which is good. From what I've seen from different Cochrane review products, I see this happening a lot. So essentially it's including a reference or a link to the full review so that people can find more detailed information. I think that's quite widespread practice, but good thing to do. There are some considerations with this one though, and I'll just talk through those. The first being that full Cochrane reviews are often not available for free in the same way that a plain language summary or abstract is. Reviews are not written for a non-expert audience, so think about your audience there and how useful it would be to give them a link to the review. And then finally, the fact that not everyone has reliable internet access or knows how to search for an academic reference. So again, consider your audience and how appropriate it is to share that information in that way, maybe an alternative. And just to show some examples of this in practice. So I think this review, this video was actually shown in module 1 of this training. So I'm not going to actually play the video, but just to highlight the fact that there was a video produced about behavioural activation therapy for depression. And towards the end of the video, you can see that the reference to the review is included, so you can do it there. And another example is a news item on cochrane.org, which includes links to the full review and other relevant resources. So quite straightforward, this one. I'm going to go a bit more sophisticated once you've got that layer of layering down. And this is preparing different layers of information ourselves. So that could be within one product, so starting with a summary of key messages and then offering more detail later on. Or you could think about a series of linked products that contain the different layers. And of course, we've got considerations there as well. The first being that we've already talked about how people have different information needs. And that can also translate to the fact that people have different preferences about what the most important information will be. And then another thing to consider is repetition. So if you're creating different layers within a product or outside of a product, the chances are that you'll be repeating information. So just think about whether that could be off-putting to your readers if you're constantly repeating things. However, repetition will be necessary at times. And if you do need to do that, make sure you're being consistent in the information you're giving. I think good ways of dealing with both of these possible issues is kind of working with your target audience, checking things with them, which is a useful thing to be doing anyway. Just so to show some examples of this type of layering, I've got this one here, which I quite like because it's a visual abstract, so a very shortened form of dissemination. But you can see at the top, we have key message, which basically tells people what the review said, and then more information if they want to. And then at the bottom, they also have links and references to the review itself. So even within a short form of dissemination, you can still do layering. Then another version, and this is more on the linked product side. So this is of a policy brief. So you have first page of your key messages. Then you have layer 2, which is a full summary of 4 or 5 pages, which go more into the details and the certainty of evidence. And then finally, you have the Cochrane review as your more comprehensive layer. Then I wanted to show you an external version because I tend to work a lot with external documents, and you'll find that layering happens quite a lot, and it's a strategy that's used very widely, especially in reports. So this is one that was produced, it was commissioned about the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was quite a big deal. It's an 86-page report. Not everyone read it all. I did. However, there was a really good page at the beginning of the summary. So it had an executive summary within the product. So that's an example of layering within the product, but they also had linked products. So on the right-hand side of the screen, that's just a screenshot of the 7-page summary they produced. And then they also had a range of multimedia content on the website as well. So you'll probably start to notice layering all around you now that I've brought it up. But yeah, that's everything from me. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Eve.
Great, thank you. Let me just share, okay. There we go. So thanks, Emma. My name is Eve, and I'm going to be talking to you about checklist item 6, which is asking, have you made the content easy for people to quickly scan and read? So in order to answer this question, and in order to make your content easy to scan and read, it's useful to understand a bit more about how people read text-based information. And often, unfortunately, the answer is probably that they're not reading it in as much detail as you might want them to, or maybe not straight away anyway. So instead, we tend to assess the relevancy and difficulty of dissemination products and what we're reading before we commit the time to actually read it all in detail. And so the way that you structure and format information can have a big impact on someone's first impression and their decision to read or listen any further. So how people read information is actually shown by this heat map. And this has been created by tracking people's eye movements on a web page. So you can see here that the red bits are where people have fixed their gaze for a while, indicating reading rather than scanning. And it's kind of shaped in an F shape. And this is a common scanning pattern. People tend to read horizontally along the top, which is usually probably reading the title. And then they might read the first line or two of text. And for languages that are read left to right, people tend to move their eyes down the left side, reading headings or the first line of a new paragraph, or maybe the first word of new lines of text. Some people may also just skip the text altogether and just look at tables or figures. So knowing all of this really should have consequences for how you write, and it shows the importance of putting thought into how you're presenting your information and why this is really important to consider, as thoughtful formatting will support comprehension. So hopefully you look at this paragraph and kind of think, that's a bit horrible, because that's what I think, and that's only a small paragraph. So what we want to avoid is chunks of text like this, which make me feel a bit like this. Thankfully, there are ways that we can make our information easier to scan and read, and we're going to speak through some of those. So the aim is to catch people's attention and make the content easy to skim. So really what we're trying to do, which Emma's already outlined, is to put the important content first. So for most audiences, this is likely to be the key results. And for most people, it's good to just give them that up front so they get the key messages. It's also useful to use short, meaningful headings and subheadings that stand out, and if possible, start them with keywords. We've seen from the heat map that tends to be what people focus on first, so it's good to kind of draw them in and make sure they know what's going on from reading those subheadings. And then also it's good to highlight keywords in bold text. I think from looking at this slide, the bold text definitely stands out, and that's quite a straightforward way of catching people's attention with what you want them to see first. It's also a good idea to break up large blocks of text into chunks. So you can use bullet points, tables, images, graphs, boxes, and try to aim to have quite a bit of white space around the text on your dissemination product. And as we also saw on the heat map, some people will just look at tables and figures. So if people are going to do that, it's important to label them clearly and make sure that they can stand alone as their own thing, so that if people are only looking at that, they still know what's going on. And another tip is to use clear, clean, and consistent fonts in line with the required branding guidelines, if applicable. So for Cochrane, the font specified by the Cochrane brand guidelines is Source Sans Pro. And when deciding on design features, it's useful to start with the same font size, weight, color, and then apply one change at a time, because then you're making sure that you're going to end up with a visual difference between the items that you want to separate with each other. You don't just change everything and then end up with an equally horrible chunk of text to look at. And then, as Emma's mentioned as well, and something we really want to stress, which links back to module 1, it's really important to consider the target audience and the context people are in when they're going to view your product, and try and think about how much information they're likely to want and how much time they're likely to have to read it. So there's also a few specific things that we think it's best to avoid, and these are listed in the dissemination checklist. So the first is baking text into images, because this isn't accessible for people with impaired vision who are using screen readers. And if you are going to do this, it's important to provide access to a transcript of the text as well. Using italics in capital letters, which are often not the easiest to read. Personally, I find when I read capitals, I think someone's shouting at me, which is not conducive to a happy reading experience. So that might just be me, but either way, it's better to kind of avoid those if possible. And then thirdly, large chunks of unbroken text. So as we've discussed, people might find this off-putting, and too much information can also distract from the main messages. So it's a good idea, if possible, to reduce the amount of information that you're including. but otherwise use techniques such as layering or bullet points, as we've discussed. So we thought we'd just show an example. So kind of trying to put all of that into practice. This is an infographic, which is for a Cochrane review I made with the Gynecology, Neuro-Oncology and Orphan Cancers group using Canva. And I think it includes some examples of good readability and structure, and also some bits that I would try to improve if I were to do it again. Obviously, we're all learning, so it's good to look back on some of these products that you've made before and think how you might change them. So I'm just going to run through some of the positives and negatives of this. So to start with, you can see that there are subheadings to structure the information, which I think is good to make the content more readable. And the main subheadings are also questions, which may draw the reader in. You might notice that we have actually not put the key finding first on this infographic, which does go against everything we've been saying. But this is an example of understanding your audience. So we made this infographic at first thinking that the audience might need this background information about brain tumors and Cochrane to understand the review. However, in the end, the infographic actually was just shared with the funder, who perhaps may not need this kind of introductory information to understand what's going on with it or the context. So in hindsight, we may have been able to just kind of start up front with the key message. But at least the key findings are signposted with a clear subheading. Another positive is the use of bold text, which, as I said, can make kind of key points stand out. But I do think that we probably could have used the bold text more sparingly to maximize effect. So maybe for keywords, or, just maybe not quite so many words in a paragraph in bold. We've used some bullet points, which makes it easy to read. And we've got a little box here which highlights the key finding. So the idea is that's a layer. I would think that perhaps it would be better if this stood out more. We're sort of restricted with this piece of work by the branding guidelines, like having to use certain colors. So we were kind of left with gray, which maybe doesn't make it pop, but it's something to consider. We've used layering in this infographic, so you can see that we've got a reference to the full review if people want to access that. It's also got an image in the top left, which is relevant to the topic area. But as you can see, we've got an image with text baked into it, which we just said is a no-no. It wouldn't be accessible for people with impaired vision using screen readers, but thankfully, I mean, it doesn't really add anything. It just says diagnosis. So it's not really key information, but still better to avoid. And so overall, I guess one of the main drawbacks with this infographic is just that it's quite a lot of text to take in. Unfortunately, this is usually the way with infographics and visual abstracts, because we always just have so much information that we need to try and get on there. And there's often a lot of important information, so it's hard to kind of whittle it down to a few key points. I think looking back on this, it may have been useful to consider creating another layer between this and the review itself, as Emma was talking about earlier. Often this all depends on the context in which people are going to be reading it and who those people will be. Here is another dissemination format. So I just wanted to show this. I don't know if many of you are making newsletters, but we thought it might just be interesting to mix it up with a different type of product. So I created this newsletter when I was working in Cochrane Cancer, and I made this using MailChimp. And this shows how you can use subheadings and images, clean and consistent fonts, white space, and color boxes to try and get across your key points. So I think, yeah, on this one, I was trying to get people to attend our network meeting. So trying to make it blue, again, trying to stick to the network color palette that we're allowed. But hopefully it shows how you can kind of create things that look clean and are easy to read. Okay, so now we've got a short video. So before rounding off this section about readability, we thought it was important to touch on what you should consider when creating dissemination products in different languages. And this probably could be a whole topic in itself and a very important one. But for today, we've just got a quick video that we're going to show, which was kindly prepared for this session by Judith Depp, Cochrane's multi-language program partner. So let me see if this works for everyone. Is this working? Maybe not.
I'm not getting audio.
No sound. Okay. I might need to stop share and reshare then. Let me try that.
It worked perfectly well in our practice.
Yeah. Here we go. It might work now. Let me reload.
When creating dissemination products for global audiences in translation, it's important to take into account possible text expansion or even contraction, because in some languages it takes more space to say the same thing as in another language, which is the result of different sentence structures, grammar, or word length. For example, a translation from English into German can expand by as much as 35%. So if you're writing texts for translation, it's always a good idea to leave additional space. In case you plan to include videos or images in your dissemination products, it's also important to plan for those in a way that they are easily translatable. For example, when it comes to embedded texts or adding subtitles. Another aspect to think about here are colors and symbols, which can have a totally different meaning or even be offensive in a different cultural setting. It's therefore always a good idea to check with somebody from that region or language to see if they can look over your work and generally be aware of cultural sensitivities.
Okay. Hopefully that worked that way around. Didn't hear anyone shouting, so I think it must have done. And so next, we're going to run through some examples of what we discussed and show a range of dissemination products. But first, we're really interested to know a bit about your experience with making dissemination products. So we're going to run a poll, which it would be great if you could select any that apply. So which of the following have you produced to disseminate your work? Tweet, Facebook post, news item, policy brief, any other, or none of these?
Oh, great. We've got our results. Interesting. We've got quite a good spread. Most of you have done tweets, some on Facebook, quite a lot of you have done news items, and a few on policy briefs, and quite a lot of you have done others. Interesting. Wonder what those would be. Sounds good. Right, so with that in mind, I'm going to share my screen again. And I am going to, hopefully you can see that fine. So now I'm going to run through a few dissemination products. And most of these refer to a single Cochrane review, which is the one that we have on the screen at the moment. So the one on quarantine for COVID-19. So we're going to show a news item, a policy brief, a tweet, and a Facebook post. The policy brief is the odd one out because unfortunately there wasn't a policy brief for this particular topic, but we still want to show you one anyway. But we thought it'd be interesting to show you how one review can be disseminated in 3 different ways and then an extra one. So I will kick off with the first one. So this is going to be a news item. So let me just open up the link while my internet thinks about it. Hopefully you can see that now. So this is one of the wordier forms of dissemination that we have available. And this was a news item published on Cochrane.org. I'll try not to scroll through too quickly so you don't get seasick. But as you can see, it collates kind of all the relevant information on this particular review. So that includes, information on the questions it asks, videos, and other dissemination products like visual abstracts, and so on. There's a lot of information on the page, but it is broken up with the different images and the blog shots, etc. And layering is used because if you look towards the end, there's a lot of links to various different products, including the full review itself. And if I go just back up to the top, the key findings are highlighted early on in this quote. And I know we've talked about the issue of kind of baking in text to an image, so that's something to bear in mind. However, that text does actually appear elsewhere in the article, so it wouldn't be unavailable to people, but kind of the role of putting in alt text could be helpful for people that use a screen reader to access information. So I think that's a summary of this one, but now I'm going to move on to the policy brief, which is the odd one out. So this one is on digital interventions for vaccine uptake. And I'm just opening it up. It's thinking about it. Okay, a few things to highlight on this one. This, I think, relates to some of the things that both Eve and I covered in our sections. So first of all, I just want to, I think you'll see the different colours and the use of white space, selective use of bold text as well, helps information stand out and makes it quite clear, the different sections. We have headers that are bold and we have bullet points. And you'll also see that on the front page, you have your key messages quite clearly highlighted. And then as you read on, you can get more detailed information on the certainty of evidence and some other considerations. So I am going to, I think that covers that one off. So now I'm going to pass over to Eve.
Okay, yeah, so now we've got a tweet here, which was by Cochrane First Aid, and it's also about the quarantine review. So of course, in a tweet, you've got fewer words you can use, so you can use 280 characters. And the tweet uses layering as well, so they don't deliver the key review findings in the tweet, which might be quite hard for a lot of Cochrane reviews in 280 characters. I mean, it's hard enough, as I was saying, in an infographic with all those words. But instead, they have a question to try and draw the reader in. So how effective is quarantine alone or in combination with other measures to control COVID-19? And if people want to know more, then they're given the link to the full review. They're also given a link to a podcast by the authors and a link to a visual abstract. And the visual abstract is actually included as an image, as you can see here, which, although it's kind of hard to read, it's good because it kind of catches people's attention as they're scrolling through endless numbers of tweets, and it's a good way to pique interest. And again, this is aimed at a broad audience. So then next we've got a Facebook post, which is also about the quarantine review. And this is also pretty brief. They've included the aim of the review, a link to the review summary, which is actually the news post that we just showed, the link to the full review, and also an image containing the review title. So really, I think they're trying to get across the main information in this image, and they've also put in capitals "just published," which I know we don't really like capitals, but I mean, I guess it catches people's attention. But one thing with Facebook is you can't use italics, so that's good. So now you've probably had enough of us talking at you. So we wanted to include breakout rooms in this webinar so that we could have smaller discussions about some of the things that we've covered. So we're going to go into breakout rooms. I think we'll have about 5 to 6 people in each, perhaps, and we're going to be in these for 10 minutes. And we'll have a facilitator in each of the groups who's going to share a document on their screen. And the document's going to contain a tweet, a Facebook post, and a news item. And your task is to please look over the products in your group and discuss what you think is good and bad about the dissemination products in terms of their structure and readability, and also how they could be improved. And we just wanted to note that we have edited these dissemination products, so they're not the original versions. And also that we expect 10 minutes probably won't be enough time to get through them all. So don't worry if you don't complete the task and get through the tweet, Facebook post, and news item. we'll provide the full document with our thoughts on the edited versions and the original versions as well afterwards on the learning experience platform. So you can have a look at those if you'd like to afterwards. Yeah, so I think Ollie's gonna send us off now. So we'll see you in a smaller room.
Right, welcome back. Here are the dogs. I hope you had some good discussions in your groups. And as Eve mentioned before, we'll share the document that we just discussed as well as a summary of our thoughts on it on the Learning Experiences platform after the sessions.
Okay, so we're actually coming towards the end of our content for this session now. And we wanted to just provide a few take-home messages before we run through the homework that we've set for you. So the first take-home message really, which I hope we've stressed throughout this webinar, is that making your content well-structured and readable should be a thoughtful process. And there's a lot of different things that you can consider whilst you're making your dissemination product in order to achieve this. It's really important to consider the type of dissemination product that you're creating, as how to structure it and make it readable will vary depending on whether you're writing a 280 character tweet or a longer news item. And hopefully looking at those different dissemination products in the breakout groups has shown some of the differences between those dissemination products and the different ways that you can make it readable and make things stand out. And then finally, considering your audience is really important, and you should try and put yourself in their position as much as possible. And with this in mind, it's good to consider what information is key and how much to include and how to increase readability for your specific target audience. And that links back to module 1, as we mentioned earlier.
And now for a quick overview of the homework. So we've got it in 2 parts. So the first being a quick structure and readability quiz. So putting some of the elements that we've discussed today into practice. And then secondly, we would love it if you could try drafting a Facebook post, a tweet or a news item to disseminate the findings of a Cochrane review based on what we've discussed today. You could either do this for a review that you're working on at the moment, or we've provided one as well. Up to you. And then if you could upload that to the Learning Experiences platform, have a look at what your peers have done and give feedback on one other piece of work, that would be really nice. And Eve and I will also be checking in and sharing our comments there. But all of this information is on the Learning Experiences platform, so have a look at that. And that takes us to the end of what we had for you today. So I'm going to pass back to Stephanie.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Eve and Emma, on that presentation and interaction on how to make our information more readable and how to organize it. I feel like I'm going to be on the lookout now as my structure and readability lens on every time I see a tweet or a Facebook post. So thanks for that. We do have some time for questions. If anybody has any questions in the chat or would like to unmute themselves or share their experience with structuring their information and their dissemination products, and whether our trainers can give you any tips on that. If not, and you'd feel more comfortable raising anything or asking anything on the Learning Experience platform, you can do that there as well. So I'll pause for a second to see if anyone wants to type or raise their hand to ask any specific questions of our trainers. All right. Well, you may have some questions after you do the homework and try and draft it yourselves. You can join us for the Ask the Trainer sessions in 2 weeks' time, and we'll go over that and also do some additional work there. Let's see. Yes, Rachel shared a recommendation for recording about how to choose images to accompany dissemination products. which is a teaser for our next module, Rachel. I don't know if you knew that, but we've got the authors of that coming in module 5 to talk about that. But everything combines in this course, as you all probably know, all the times that we say consider your target audience. It's all a big mishmash of information. Okay, so I'm happy to close the session and give you back some more time in your day. I just wanted to mention that I sent around a survey yesterday to ask what you wanted your topic to be for the November, the final module of this course. I said it was a doodle in the email. I meant a survey, so apologies for that confusion. But if you can fill that out and let us know so that we can pick our final topic of the course for the November module. Otherwise, we'll see you online. We'll see you in 2 weeks' time for Ask the Trainers. And thanks again to Eve and Emma for the presentation today. And take care, everyone.